In an effort to be granted permission to demolish it, the billionaire sponsors a Thanksgiving activity at the community center. When he arrives, he is speechless when he sees a picture of his grandfather and the pictures on the wall. Before we dive into the story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Stay tuned until the end, things are about to get intense. Now, let's get into it. Lucas Thornton was a name that opened doors and closed deals. His reputation as a shrewd investor who turned crumbling historic sites into gleaming, high-end properties was as polished as the expensive shoes he wore. In business circles, he was admired and feared in equal measure. The magazines called him a visionary, detractors whispered that he had a heart of stone. To Lucas, both were badges of honor. Success, as he defined it, left no room for sentiment or hesitation. That's what brought him to the community center this evening, a structure caught in the twilight between cherished local relic and prime real estate opportunity. He'd run the numbers, assessed the architectural potential, and calculated the profit margins down to the last decimal. The community center, with its worn-out facade and generations of memories, was to become luxury condos that would change the skyline and fill his investors' pockets. The Thanksgiving event was his move on the chessboard, designed not just to show goodwill but to pacify any whispers of resistance. He sponsored it under the guise of community support, but in truth, it was a PR stunt, an opportune moment to sway local leaders who had hesitated to sign off on the project. Lucas viewed the evening as a predictable play in a game he always won. As he stepped out of his sleek black car, the brisk November air nipped at his face. The community center loomed before him, its brickwork aged and softened by time. Twinkling orange and yellow lights were strung across the entrance, giving it an air of warmth Lucas had long since forgotten how to feel. He walked in with measured steps, nodding politely at the volunteers who offered smiles too wide, too eager to welcome their benefactor. Inside, the hall was alive with chatter and laughter. Tables were decorated with small pumpkins and hand-painted leaves, evidence of efforts by someone who still believed in such things. The scent of roasted turkey and spiced cider filled the room, a smell that should have been comforting but only reminded Lucas of obligations. His own Thanksgivings had been more about formalities and business alliances than gratitude or joy. "Mr. Thornton. Thank you for coming," said a bright voice. Mrs. Green, the coordinator, bustled over, her silver hair bouncing as she moved. Her eyes were sharp but kind, like a schoolteacher who believed in discipline but also second chances. Lucas returned her greeting with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Green. It's an honor to support the community," he said, the practiced sincerity slipping effortlessly from his lips. She beamed, unaware, or perhaps choosing to ignore, the calculation behind his words. "We're so grateful for your contribution. It means a lot, especially with everything the center has faced these past years," she said, her voice softening. Lucas nodded, already scanning the room for the local council members. He spotted them across the hall, talking among themselves, glancing in his direction. A few parents with children waved, recognizing his face from the articles and news segments. He acknowledged them briefly, his mind running scenarios. By the end of the night, he needed those officials to see him not as a developer, but as someone invested in the community's well-being, at least long enough to push the deal forward. As he made his way toward them, he overheard snippets of conversations. An older woman spoke fondly of past events held at the center, her voice laced with nostalgia. A young girl tugged at her mother's sleeve, pointing excitedly to the dessert table. Volunteers bustled around, balancing trays of steaming dishes. The chatter, the bursts of laughter, all of it felt like static to Lucas, a reminder of a world he chose to sidestep long ago. He was here for a purpose, not the warmth that seemed to infuse the air. Still, he moved with the practiced ease of a man who could read a room like a stock market report. He knew how to tailor his approach, calibrate his tone, and offer just the right amount of charm to secure an advantage. Reaching the small knot of council members, he slipped into their conversation smoothly. "Good to see familiar faces," Lucas said, extending a hand to Mr. Patel, the head of the council. Patel, a stout man with kind eyes, grasped it firmly, his expression a blend of respect and wariness. "Lucas, glad you could join us," Patel said, his voice formal. The others nodded, some more reluctantly than others. Lucas took note, filing away their expressions for later. "It's important to show support, especially during the holidays," Lucas continued, letting his smile widen just a fraction. "The work you all do here is invaluable. I hope tonight's event serves as a reminder of what's possible when we come together for the community." Patel nodded slowly, eyes flicking around the room to take in the families, the volunteers, and the laughter that wrapped itself around them all. Lucas held his breath a moment, the weight of the room pressing down on him. For a fleeting second, he felt an inexplicable pull, like an echo of something buried so deep it barely registered. But just as quickly, he dismissed it, tightening his focus. "Well, Lucas, the community is grateful for your support," Patel said, though the words carried a caution that hinted at discussions still to be had. Lucas inclined his head, hiding any sign of impatience. He knew that swaying opinions wasn't a sprint but a marathon, one he was well equipped to win. Before anyone could say more, a group of children dashed past, their laughter slicing through the air. One stumbled, narrowly missing Lucas, who instinctively reached out, catching the boy before he fell. The child's wide eyes met Lucas's, a mix of surprise and embarrassment coloring his face. Lucas released him, mumbling a rare, "Be careful," before stepping back. Patel watched the interaction, his expression softening by degrees. Lucas seized the moment, turning back with a nod. "It's places like this that build the foundation for future generations. I'm here to make sure that's not lost." A few of the council members exchanged glances, their guarded skepticism wavering. The move had been calculated, but it was effective. Lucas's gaze swept across the room once more, the flicker of warmth in others' faces challenging the detachment he wore like armor. The warm hum of conversation receded as Lucas's eyes fell on the wall of photographs tucked between two display cases. It was a visual timeline, a parade of smiles and memories captured over decades. He hadn't meant to linger, but one image seemed to reach out, pulling him into its frame. The air around him seemed to still as he stepped closer. The photo was yellowed at the edges, its colors faded but the moment vividly preserved. His grandfather, Edward Thornton, stood in the middle, his arm casually draped over the shoulder of a young woman with a wide grin. Around them, children beamed, pies cooling on a table in the background. The energy of a shared celebration burst from the picture, as real as the laughter that floated through the hall behind Lucas. Edward's face was different here, unburdened and bright, unlike the rigid portraits that hung in the Thornton mansion, images that spoke of power, not joy. A strange sensation rippled through Lucas, a crack in the shell of certainty that had always surrounded his understanding of his family's history. This wasn't the man he knew from stories, the relentless business mogul, the epitome of ambition. The contradiction unsettled him. He'd been raised on a legacy of deals closed and empires expanded, where charity was only worth the tax deductions it provided. "Everything all right, Mr. Thornton?" Mrs. Green's voice interrupted his thoughts, bringing him back to the present. She had approached quietly, the genuine concern in her eyes contrasting with the usual deference he was used to. Lucas nodded absently before gesturing to the photo. "That picture, my grandfather. What was he doing here?" A fond smile spread across Mrs. Green's face as she glanced at the image. "Oh, that's one of my favorites," she said, her voice softening with nostalgia. "Edward Thornton was one of the first to help establish this center. He didn't just fund it, he was here, volunteering, attending events. He even cooked once, though we all agreed he should stick to making speeches," she added with a chuckle. Lucas felt a prickle of disbelief. "My grandfather? Edward Thornton? He was involved?" "Very much so," Mrs. Green affirmed. "He was a pillar of support, not just with money, but with his time and kindness. It surprised a lot of people, considering how busy he was, but he always made it here, especially for Thanksgiving." Lucas's mind whirled. The Edward he had known from stories was a man who expected results, not someone who found time to volunteer at a community event. He searched for the detached mask he usually wore in meetings, but it felt impossible to slip back on. His eyes darted over the rest of the wall, half expecting to find more evidence that might explain away what he had just learned, but nothing did. "Why?" he finally asked, voice lower, as though speaking to himself. "Why would he do that when the business needed him so much?" Mrs. Green's expression shifted, her smile fading into a thoughtful line. "Maybe he believed that some things were worth more than business," she said gently. Back then, this center was more than just brick and mortar to him. He knew the people, their stories. It mattered to him. The idea unsettled Lucas more than he wanted to admit. His grandfather was supposed to have been a man of singular focus. Every story Martin Thornton, Lucas's father, told him was threaded with tales of discipline, cold calculations, and a will strong enough to forge the family empire. But this photo, this simple memento, contradicted that narrative entirely. Lucas's phone vibrated in his pocket, an urgent reminder of the real reason he was here. He ignored it. For the first time in a long while, his mind wasn't consumed by numbers or strategies. It was a whirlwind of questions. He looked at Mrs. Green, who was now watching him closely, her eyes searching for a reaction beyond the stony exterior he wore. "Mrs. Green, do you remember anything else about his time here? Any stories, perhaps?" Lucas asked, surprising even himself. The words tasted unfamiliar, curiosity not being a trait he often indulged outside boardrooms. The older woman nodded slowly, her expression softening again. "There are many stories. He used to stay after events to speak with families, learn their names, their challenges. It was as if this place gave him something the boardrooms couldn't. And people here never forgot that." Lucas felt a pang of something he couldn't name. Regret? Frustration? He wasn't sure. The hall's festive decorations now seemed out of place, the cheerful garlands clashing with the disquiet settling inside him. What would his father say if he knew Lucas was standing here, piecing together fragments of a story never told at home? Did he ever mention why he did it? Lucas asked, the urgency slipping into his tone despite his attempts to control it. Mrs. Green's eyes grew distant, as if sifting through time. "Not in so many words. But once, during one of the Thanksgiving events, he spoke to me about balance, about how life shouldn't be all about one thing. I didn't understand it much at the time, but now, it makes sense." Lucas's breath caught. Balance. It was a word that felt foreign in the world of deals and takeovers, where success demanded all or nothing. The clatter of utensils and laughter around him felt louder, the room more stifling. He turned his gaze back to the photo one last time, trying to reconcile the image of Edward Thornton laughing with children with the man who was a fixture in corporate lore. "Thank you, Mrs. Green," Lucas said finally, each word carefully measured. "I think I have some things to consider." Her smile returned, warmer this time. You're always welcome to learn more, Mr. Thornton. Sometimes, the past holds more than we expect. Lucas nodded, feeling the weight of her words press against him as he stepped away. The photo, now behind him, felt like a tether, an anchor to a version of his grandfather he had yet to meet. As he walked toward the center of the room, where council members awaited, he realized this evening might not be the mere formality he had planned. For the first time, Lucas felt the stirrings of doubt, and with it, a need for answers. Lucas paced the length of his penthouse, the glow of the city below casting jagged shadows across the sleek, modern furnishings. His phone sat on the marble counter, waiting. The moment stretched, taut and unrelenting, until Lucas snatched it up, scrolling to his father's number. It rang twice before Martin Thornton's brusque voice cut through. "Lucas, it's late. This better be important." "It is," Lucas snapped, his tone sharper than he intended. He drew in a breath, steadying himself. "I was at the community center tonight. I saw a photo of Grandpa there, surrounded by people from the neighborhood. Did you know he was so involved with that place?" A pause, heavy with the silence of unsaid things, crackled over the line. When Martin spoke again, his voice was colder, dismissive. "Edward's time at that center was a diversion, Lucas. An old man's indulgence that distracted him from what mattered." Lucas's fingers tightened around the phone, the edges biting into his palm. "A diversion? People spoke of him like he was a hero. Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because it was irrelevant. The center was never supposed to be part of the Thornton legacy. Your grandfather had his flaws, Lucas, and getting tangled up in that community was one of them. He nearly lost sight of what built this family's fortune." The words sank like stones, creating ripples of anger and confusion. Lucas's jaw clenched as he tried to bridge the widening gap between what he had always been told and the hints of a story he was beginning to unearth. "It doesn't add up, Dad. The way people spoke about him, it's as if he wanted something different. Something more than just power and money." Martin's tone hardened, cutting off the budding questions. "This is pointless, Lucas. Edward's priorities changed at the end, but that's not the story we tell. What we have today, our influence, our status, comes from putting business first. Don't forget that." The call ended abruptly, leaving Lucas standing in silence. The city lights glittered indifferently outside, a constellation of success that had lost some of its luster. He set the phone down, the unanswered questions thrumming louder. If his father was so eager to dismiss Edward's connection to the center, what else was being hidden? Determined, Lucas settled into the leather chair by his desk and pulled out his laptop. Hours passed as he sifted through archived articles and community records, eyes scanning for any mention of Edward Thornton. Each click and scroll uncovered a new detail: a fundraising gala for local families, a volunteer project to rebuild the playground, an old interview where Edward spoke about community as a foundation, not just an asset. Lucas's pulse quickened when he stumbled upon an article buried in the archives of a local paper, dated just months before Edward's sudden death. It featured a small photo of Edward with a woman named Maria Castellano, described as a local advocate and teacher who had partnered with him on numerous projects. Her eyes were bright, full of conviction, and Edward stood beside her, a rare, unguarded smile on his face. He leaned back, the room around him feeling both smaller and louder. Maria Castellano. The name gnawed at his curiosity, hinting at a deeper story. Who was she to Edward, and why had her name never crossed his path before? The answer, Lucas realized, wouldn't come from more articles or grainy photographs. He needed to speak to someone who remembered. Someone who could tell him what the archives could not. The next morning, Lucas found himself back at the community center. The morning sun streamed through the stained glass windows, casting fractured light across the worn wood floors. The air was quieter now, absent of the festive chatter from the night before. Only a few volunteers moved through the space, tidying up remnants of the event. Mrs. Green was there, sorting through a box of decorations. She glanced up, surprised to see Lucas so early, the weight of questions etched across his usually composed features. "Mr. Thornton," she said, straightening up with a smile that hinted at worry. "What brings you back so soon?" "Questions," he said, cutting straight to the point. "You mentioned my grandfather's commitment to this place. But I found something that suggests he had more than just a passing interest. There was a woman, Maria Castellano. Do you know anything about her?" Mrs. Green's eyes softened, touched by a distant fondness. Maria was a force of nature. She loved this community, fought for it with every bit of her being. She and Edward were close. They shared the same vision for this place, one that went beyond dollars and deals. But that kind of passion comes with its own risks. Lucas's brow furrowed. "Risks? What do you mean?" She inspired him to think beyond his legacy, to see people as more than just figures on a balance sheet. It wasn't popular with everyone, especially not with those who relied on Edward staying true to the business. There were whispers that his plans were changing, that he intended to shift the focus of the family's efforts. But then, he passed so suddenly, Mrs. Green said, her voice trailing into an uneasy quiet. A chill moved through Lucas, a new layer of the story beginning to take shape. Edward hadn't just been kind or generous, he had been on the verge of changing everything. And Maria had been part of that. What had stopped him? The room felt charged, history pressing against Lucas with an urgency that was both exhilarating and disconcerting. He needed to find Maria or someone connected to her, someone who could fill in the gaps that Martin had clearly tried to bury. "Do you know where I could find Maria now?" Lucas asked, his voice steady, but beneath it lay a hunger for answers. Mrs. Green sighed, the weight of time in her eyes. "Maria passed away years ago, but her daughter, Maya, still lives in town. She's a journalist now, carrying on her mother's spirit. If anyone can tell you the truth, it's her." Lucas's chest tightened. The path ahead was fraught with more than he'd bargained for, but he felt a pull he couldn't ignore. Edward's story, once a footnote in the annals of Thornton business history, was now a mystery demanding to be solved. And Lucas was ready to confront whatever truths lay ahead, no matter how they challenged everything he thought he knew. The midday sun filtered through the aging windows of the community center, casting patches of light on the floor as Lucas sat at a corner table. His usual air of control felt shaken, frayed at the edges. Conversations hummed around him, people discussing everything from last night's event to the future of the center. His presence, however, was not as unnoticed as he might have wished. Some faces turned to look at him, eyes narrowed with guarded suspicion. He could feel the weight of judgment, heavy and raw. A man in his 60s, with weathered hands and a voice that crackled with years of stories, approached. "You're Edward Thornton's grandson, aren't you?" His tone was not hostile, but there was a challenge in it. Lucas nodded, meeting the man's gaze. "I am. I'd been trying to learn more about my grandfather's involvement here," Lucas said, the practiced polish in his voice giving way to something more earnest. The man raised an eyebrow, taking a slow sip of the coffee he held. "You've got a lot of nerve showing up now, after all the noise about turning this place into condos," the man said, the room suddenly feeling quieter as nearby conversations paused. "Edward was one of us. He didn't just write checks, he was here, day in and day out, putting his heart into this place. He sacrificed for it." Lucas felt a sting at the back of his throat. Sacrificed? The word felt heavy, as though it hinted at stories he'd never heard. The man nodded slowly. Your grandfather wanted to use his influence to make real changes. He had big plans, some that didn't sit well with everyone in his circle. He was torn, you know, between this place and the pressure from those who thought his focus should be elsewhere. It's why we respected him. He understood that community isn't built on power, but on people. The air thickened with the past, stories flowing from nearby tables as others joined in, voices layering one over another. There were memories of Edward lifting children onto his shoulders at holiday fairs, working late nights alongside volunteers, his laughter blending with theirs. It was an image so removed from the legacy Lucas had been raised to emulate that it made his chest tighten. A woman, her gray hair pulled into a loose bun, added, there was talk that Edward wanted to shift the whole Thornton business approach, move away from just profits to include projects that would benefit people, places like this center. But it wasn't meant to be. Lucas was about to ask more when a voice cut through, clear and resolute. It's true. He turned to see a young woman with dark, determined eyes stepping forward. She was slender, dressed in a casual outfit that couldn't quite hide the journalist's notebook she clutched in her hand. The room seemed to shift as she walked closer, the recognition in the eyes of those around her palpable. I'm Maya Castellano, she said, watching Lucas with a mixture of curiosity and guarded trust. My mother was Maria Castellano. I think we need to talk. Lucas nodded, feeling the pulse of anticipation. They moved to a quieter corner, where the sounds of clinking cups and murmured conversations faded into the background. Maya's eyes flickered with intensity as she spoke, the notebook resting on her knee. I was surprised to see you here, she began, a hint of challenge in her voice. People don't usually come looking for answers about their past when they're planning to erase it. Lucas met her gaze. I didn't know, he admitted, and for the first time, the words felt raw, true. I didn't know what Edward meant to this place, to your mother. I was told he only cared about the family business. Maya's expression softened, but only slightly. That's what they wanted you to believe. Edward had plans to realign Thornton Industries, to push for projects that would support communities instead of just exploiting them. He wanted the business to be a force for good. Why didn't he? Lucas asked, though the answer seemed close enough to grasp. Maya's voice dipped, a shadow crossing her features. He didn't get the chance. His death was sudden, and it raised a lot of questions. Some said it was natural causes, but my mother never believed that. Edward was healthy, driven, and planning a big announcement just weeks before he passed. Lucas felt the room spin, the certainties of his upbringing cracking at the edges. He'd always been told Edward's death was a turning point, yes, but one that had galvanized the family's commitment to business, not fractured it. That it might have been surrounded by doubt was unthinkable, a thread pulled from the fabric of a story so carefully maintained. Maya reached into her bag, pulling out a folded sheet of yellowed paper. She handed it to him with a solemn look. I found this among my mother's things after she passed. It's a note Edward wrote her, talking about his intention to shift the company's priorities. It's not signed, but my mother kept it all those years. It meant something. Lucas unfolded the paper, eyes scanning the words. Edward's handwriting was unmistakable, slanted, deliberate. The letter spoke of dreams larger than any boardroom, of partnerships with the community that would cement real, lasting change. Lucas's chest ached as he read, the implications cutting through the noise of his upbringing. His grandfather's last years had not been marked by a faltering focus but by an unyielding drive towards something greater. The room, now just a backdrop, seemed frozen as Lucas took in the depth of what he was holding. His grandfather's legacy wasn't just one of power and financial prowess. It was threaded with moments of empathy, risk, and a vision that had been silenced too soon. Maya watched him, her expression softening further. "So, what are you going to do now, Mr. Thornton? People here see you as the man trying to tear down what Edward built. But maybe it doesn't have to be that way." Lucas took a long breath, eyes flicking to the community members who now watched him with quiet expectation. The truth he'd just learned felt heavier than any deal he'd brokered, but it was clear now what his next move had to be. The past had spoken, and it was time for him to decide if he'd let it change his future. The stack of yellowed clippings Maya had handed him sat on Lucas's desk, their faded headlines and grainy photos spilling secrets he hadn't known he was desperate to hear. Lucas leaned back in his chair, eyes tracing the lines of text as if they could speak the truth aloud. Article after article painted a picture that both fascinated and disturbed him. Edward Thornton, celebrated businessman, had been on the cusp of change. The words "sudden death" appeared too many times, framed by whispers of meetings that hadn't gone as planned and a new direction for the Thornton empire that never came to pass. There were small, almost imperceptible clues, a sentence about Edward's increased visits to the community center, a mention of a public proposal that was curiously pulled last minute, and, most unsettling, a few speculative lines about the days leading up to his death. The phrase, "family tensions," repeated enough that it began to twist in Lucas's gut. If Edward had been more than the relentless entrepreneur everyone said he was, who had wanted to keep that buried? A soft chime broke the silence as Lucas's phone buzzed. Martin's name glared at him from the screen, almost as if it knew he'd been avoiding the inevitable. Lucas pressed his thumb to the call button, but before he could speak, his father's voice, clipped and commanding, filled the line. "Lucas, I've been hearing that you've been asking questions," Martin said, words sharp as glass. "The board's been calling, concerned about what exactly you're up to." "I'll bet they are," Lucas replied, his tone cold. He stood and walked to the window, the city a glittering maze beneath him. "You never told me Edward's death wasn't straightforward. You never said there were doubts, or that he was trying to shift the company's focus before he died." The silence on the other end was a living thing, a moment stretched too thin. When Martin finally spoke, there was no trace of warmth. "You're chasing ghosts, Lucas. Edward's death was a tragedy, yes, but natural. No one in their right mind believes otherwise. Whatever you've dug up." "It's not just whatever, Dad," Lucas interrupted, his patience fraying. "Maya Castellano gave me notes, articles, even a letter Edward wrote about reshaping the company. He was ready to change everything. Why keep that from me? From everyone?" The pause returned, a storm gathering in the distance. Martin's voice, when it came back, was harder, carrying an edge that sliced through any illusion of civility. "Because it was foolish. Your grandfather's ideas were naive. You think you're the first to romanticize what he was planning? I protected this family's legacy, Lucas. Edward wanted to redirect our resources to vanity projects, community centers, low-income developments that would have sunk us. It would have destroyed everything." Lucas felt something inside him shift, old loyalties cracking under the weight of new understanding. "And how far were you willing to go to make sure those plans died with him?" The question hung in the air, its accusation impossible to take back. "I won't dignify that with an answer," Martin snapped, his voice tight, barely contained. "What I will say is that you're playing with fire. The board won't tolerate a scandal, especially not one stoked by their own." "So it's about appearances," Lucas said, bitterness creeping into his words. He turned away from the window, facing the papers scattered on his desk as if they were allies in this fight. "You'd rather protect the image of what Edward was than deal with the truth of who he really was." Martin's voice dropped to a warning, the quiet of it more chilling than any shout. Be careful, Lucas. You don't know what you're tampering with. Let sleeping dogs lie, or you'll risk everything you think you're trying to honor. No, Lucas said, his voice steady with a resolve that surprised even him. I think it's time we stop lying to ourselves. Edward wanted more, and maybe that's what we should be fighting for. A long silence followed, one that pressed against Lucas like a second skin. Finally, Martin spoke, but all the bluster was gone, replaced by something that almost sounded like desperation. You're tearing at threads that kept us together. If you keep pulling, there won't be anything left. Is that what you want? To destroy what he built? What he built, Lucas repeated, each word precise, wasn't just boardrooms and skyscrapers. He built hope. And if you've spent all these years smothering that to protect some illusion of strength, then maybe what we have left isn't worth keeping. Martin's silence was an answer in itself, a quiet concession wrapped in stubbornness. Without another word, the call ended, the disconnect ringing out like an accusation. Lucas let the phone drop onto the desk, its weight suddenly insignificant compared to the burden now on his shoulders. He sifted through the clippings once more, fingers brushing over phrases that spoke of courage and sacrifice. Edward's vision had been silenced before it could take root, and now it was up to Lucas to decide whether to let that dream remain buried or dig deeper, knowing the risks. A knock at the door startled him. One of his assistants poked her head in, eyes wary. Mr. Thornton? The board is asking for an update. Should I tell them you'll be joining the call soon? Lucas hesitated, the image of his grandfather, vibrant and determined, flashing before him. He took a breath and squared his shoulders. No, he said, voice firm. Tell them I'm busy. There are more important things to take care of right now. The door closed, leaving him alone with the weight of his choice. The echoes of Martin's voice still hummed in the air, but they were drowned out by the sound of something else, the quiet, persistent beat of a new path forming, one step at a time. The old house stood at the edge of town, its paint chipped and the garden overgrown with wildflowers that had long since stopped being tamed. Lucas took a breath before knocking, the weight of the past pressing hard against his chest. He had tracked down George, a man whose name surfaced only after hours of digging through community center records and whispered anecdotes. George had been Edward Thornton's confidant in a way few others had. If there were truths still hidden, this man would know them. The door creaked open, revealing a tall figure with deep-set eyes and a stooped posture. George's weathered face was lined with age, but his gaze was sharp as it swept over Lucas. Recognition flickered, followed by guarded skepticism. Lucas Thornton, George said, more a statement than a greeting. His voice was rough but steady. I thought it was a mistake when you called. Lucas managed a small smile, one that felt strained and unfamiliar. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't important, George. I need to know about my grandfather. Not the stories my father told, but the truth. George sighed, glancing at the sunlight waning behind Lucas, before stepping aside. Come in. The inside of George's home was modest, cluttered with framed photographs and relics of a life fully lived. Lucas's eyes were drawn to a small, black and white photo of Edward and George, their arms slung over each other's shoulders, grins wide and genuine. Coffee? George asked, already moving toward the kitchen. No, thank you, Lucas replied, hands fidgeting as he stood. The tension in the room was palpable, an undercurrent of anticipation and old loyalties. George returned, folding himself into an armchair with a sigh. You're here about Edward, aren't you? George said, watching Lucas intently. I suppose you've heard the sanitized version of who he was. Lucas nodded. And I found out he was close to someone named Maria Castellano. She meant something to him, didn't she? George's eyes darkened, the lines of his face deepening. For a long moment, he was silent, as if weighing the trustworthiness of the man in front of him. Finally, he leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. Maria was the heart of this community, Lucas. Your grandfather met her at a fundraising event. She was magnetic, fierce in her beliefs that everyone, no matter their standing, deserved dignity and support. Edward was intrigued, and it wasn't long before he was spending more time here, learning from her. Lucas felt a pang in his chest, a strange mixture of pride and sadness. He loved her, he said, the words coming out more as a realization than a question. George's eyes softened. He did. But it was more than love, Lucas. Maria challenged him. She showed him that the success he'd been taught to chase wasn't enough. He wanted to step away from it all, to work with her at the center, build something real. They had plans to expand the center's reach, create programs that would change lives. He was ready to break away from the weight of the family business. The room grew heavier with George's words. Lucas felt the story he had been told his whole life unravel, each thread revealing a truth he hadn't known to look for. But the family wouldn't let him, Lucas whispered, piecing together the bitter puzzle. George nodded, the motion slow and deliberate. Edward was torn between what he wanted and the expectations that had been pressed on him since he was a boy. The board, his business partners, even your father, they saw his shift as a threat. He was meant to expand the empire, not turn it into a platform for charity. The silence that followed was loud, filled with questions Lucas couldn't form fast enough. And his death? Lucas finally asked, voice tight. Was it really as sudden as everyone says? George's expression darkened further, a shadow passing over his eyes. It was sudden, yes. One moment, he was on the verge of making his announcement about the new direction for Thornton Industries. The next, he was gone. There were no official investigations, just murmurs that were swept away by those with the power to keep them quiet. Lucas's hands tightened into fists at his sides. The weight of lost opportunities and silenced dreams pressed against him, suffocating. Did Maria know? George's eyes glistened, and he looked away for a moment. Maria suspected, but by then, she had already lost the man she loved and the future they had planned. She kept going, though. Her work, her passion, it became her way of honoring him. But over time, even that took its toll. Lucas's breath caught, imagining the devastation Maria must have felt, the burden of carrying on without Edward by her side. The room seemed to close in, the air thick with history and regret. Why didn't anyone ever tell me? Lucas asked, the question escaping as a plea. Why was I only taught half the story? George's gaze turned steely, his voice hardening with the weight of truth. Because it was easier to forget the parts that didn't align with what the family wanted. They erased Edward's choices, turned him into what they needed him to be, a symbol of ambition, not compassion. The finality of George's words struck deep. The man Lucas had idolized, shaped by stories of relentless drive and unyielding focus, was so much more. He had been a man willing to risk it all, to forge a different path not defined by profits alone. Lucas stood, the ache in his chest now aflame, pushing him toward a choice. Thank you, George, he said, his voice thick but resolute. I needed to hear this. George's expression softened, a hint of hope breaking through the lines of his face. If you really want to honor him, Lucas, don't let his vision stay buried. It's not too late to choose differently. Lucas nodded, a sense of purpose sparking inside him. The legacy he thought he knew was gone, replaced by a truer, richer one. And now, it was up to him to decide how to move forward, carrying the weight of Edward's unfinished dreams. The early morning light struggled to break through the storm clouds gathering over the city, casting a somber glow over the community center. Lucas stood by the large window in his office, the newspaper in his hands crackling under the pressure of his grip. The headline in bold letters read, "Thornton Investigation Sparks Outrage. Community Fights Back." The accompanying photo showed a crowd gathered in front of the center, their faces a mix of anger and determination, handmade signs raised high. "Save our center, Edward's legacy, not luxury," they proclaimed in splashes of paint and cardboard. Lucas set the paper down and rubbed his temples. The pressure building inside him was suffocating. What had started as a search for answers had now spiraled into a public battle, one that threatened not just his project but the very fabric of what he thought defined him. He wanted to feel justified in pressing forward, to silence the unease gnawing at him. Yet each protester's face was a reminder that this was more than just another business move. It was personal, for them and for him. A soft knock at the door broke through his thoughts. He glanced up as Maya stepped in, her expression cautious but resolute. The way she looked at him was different now, not just with the suspicion of a journalist seeking a story, but with an understanding that came from shared revelations. "You've seen the news, I assume," she said, nodding toward the paper. Lucas exhaled slowly, gesturing for her to take a seat. "Hard to miss," he said, his voice clipped with fatigue. "Everywhere I turn, there's another reason telling me to stop. But stopping means... I don't know what it means anymore." "It means choosing what kind of Thornton you want to be," Maya said, her words deliberate. She reached into her bag and pulled out a yellowed piece of paper, the edges frayed and corners bent from years of careful keeping. She handed it to Lucas. "I found this in my mother's old files. It's an agreement Edward wrote, a promise to the community." Lucas unfolded the paper, the ink faded but legible. It was a handwritten pledge, a commitment Edward had made to provide long-term support and resources to the center and its surrounding neighborhoods. The lines spoke of partnership and vision, not as a ploy for recognition, but as an unselfish gift. It was dated just a month before Edward's sudden death. "It's not legally binding," Maya said, breaking the silence, "but if this gets out, it will shift everything. The community already sees you as the man who wants to erase what Edward stood for. This will make that belief ironclad." Lucas stared at the paper, the weight of his grandfather's unfulfilled vision pressing on him. Edward's intentions had been clear. He had wanted the center to be a foundation for growth, a place where people could feel valued beyond their economic worth. Lucas felt the tension inside him stretch thin. Part of him, the part honed by years in boardrooms, whispered that to back down would be a sign of weakness. But another part, the one that had been awakened by stories of Edward's love for this place, insisted that protecting what mattered wasn't a loss, but a different kind of victory. The protests outside intensified as the day wore on. Voices rose in unison, calling for justice, for remembrance, for Edward's vision to be honored. Lucas watched from the window as children played on the steps of the center, oblivious to the adults' tension, their laughter ringing out like a reminder of what was at stake. A woman handed out hot chocolate to the crowd, her smile bright even in the rain. The scene was both chaotic and beautiful, a testament to what the center represented. Maya's voice cut through the noise. "Lucas, you don't have to be trapped by the past decisions of your father or even the legacy Edward didn't finish. This is your chance to decide." The truth of her words hit hard. For years, Lucas had been chasing the shadow of success defined by spreadsheets and profit margins. But here, in the faces of those fighting to preserve a place built on shared hope, he saw a different kind of legacy, a living, breathing one that extended beyond numbers and status. Lucas paced, his mind racing through scenarios. He could push forward, bulldozing his way to another completed project and the accolades that came with it. Or he could stop, risking everything he'd built in the eyes of investors but finally standing for something more. The choice clawed at him, insistent and urgent. Finally, he turned back to Maya, who was watching him with that patient intensity. "If we release this," Lucas said, gesturing to the paper in his hand, "there's no going back. The board will fight me. My father." "Your father already sees you as a challenge," Maya said gently. "This isn't about him anymore. It's about what you want your name to mean when people speak it." A sudden knock at the door startled them both. One of Lucas's aides poked their head in, eyes wide. "Sir, the mayor's office just called. They want to know your stance before making a public statement about the protests." Lucas met Maya's eyes, the tension coiling tighter, then glanced back at the paper in his hand. He thought of Edward, of the dreams that had been silenced too soon, and of the people now gathered outside fighting for more than a building. They were fighting for history, for community, for the dreams they inherited from a man who refused to let ambition eclipse compassion. "Tell them I'll be making a statement of my own," Lucas said, voice steady, a decision taking shape behind his eyes. The aide nodded, disappearing back down the hallway. Maya's smile was subtle but warm, a hint of relief softening her features. "Are you sure about this?" Lucas looked down at the paper one last time, its words now as familiar as his own. "I have to be," he said. "It's time to finish what Edward started." Outside, the wind picked up, sending the rain sideways across the protesting crowd. But Lucas saw their determination hold fast, unwavering even against the elements. He took a deep breath and turned away from the window, ready to step into the storm. Lucas's office was steeped in an uneasy quiet. The storm that raged inside him had not yet reached the outside world, but the air felt charged, as if something momentous was on the brink. The faint hum of the city below was interrupted by the sudden buzz of his phone. The caller ID flashed Martin Thornton. Lucas's chest tightened as he answered. "Lucas, what are you doing?" Martin's voice was sharp, each word slicing through the silence like a blade. Lucas could picture him standing in his own office, jaw clenched, eyes cold. "I'm making things right," Lucas replied evenly, surprised by how steady he sounded. The words carried a certainty that made Martin's harsh laugh on the other end feel hollow. "Right? You mean throwing everything away?" Martin's tone shifted from incredulous to biting. "Do you understand what's at stake? If you release that agreement, if you publicly back this sentimental nonsense, you won't just hurt the company, you'll ruin it. And you can forget any place you have in this family's future." Lucas swallowed, his grip on the phone tightening. The threat was expected, yet it still stung. "Is that what this is really about, Dad? Control? We've already lost so much of who we were supposed to be. Edward tried to change that, and you silenced it." Edward's vision was naive, Martin spat. "This family has power because we make hard choices. You're risking everything for what? A piece of paper and old memories? If you do this, you're out, Lucas. The board will back me, and I'll cut you off. No more shares, no more support. You'll be on your own." A heavy silence followed, but it wasn't enough to dislodge the truth Lucas now held close. "I'd rather be on my own," he said quietly, then continue lying about what Edward stood for. The line went dead, but the echoes of Martin's warning hung in the room like an accusation. Lucas set the phone down, the rush of the conversation draining from him, leaving behind only the raw knowledge that he was now on the precipice of losing everything he'd once thought defined him. Before doubt could settle, he grabbed his coat and left the office, heading for the only place he felt he might find the last pieces of clarity he needed. The Castellano house was modest, surrounded by a garden full of marigolds and lavender that rustled in the breeze. Maria, now elderly but still radiating a quiet strength, answered the door herself. Her eyes, dark and knowing, softened when she saw Lucas. "Come in, Lucas," she said, her voice warm but lined with age. She led him to a small living room where photos lined the mantel, snapshots of community events, some familiar faces from the center. In one corner, a picture of Maria and Edward, their expressions mirroring pride and joy, made Lucas pause. "You look like him, you know," Maria said, watching Lucas with a mixture of affection and curiosity. "There's the same fire in your eyes, though yours took longer to light." Lucas felt his chest tighten. "I needed to understand him, beyond the stories my father told. I'm starting to, but there's still so much I don't know." Maria sat across from him, hands clasped in her lap. Edward dreamed of more than Thornton Industries. He loved the community because it reminded him that life was about more than money. It gave him a freedom he couldn't find in boardrooms or annual reports. Her eyes turned misty, and she paused to gather herself. But he struggled. The family legacy was an anchor, and the pressure, especially from Martin, was relentless. Lucas looked down, the weight of family history pressing on him. Martin always said Edward's death was just a tragedy. But now, it feels like more than that. Maria nodded, the pain of old memories etched into her face. Edward was going to step back from the business, to work here, with us, full-time. He had plans laid out, ones that would have shifted everything. But before he could, he passed, and those plans disappeared with him. Your father, well, he feared what Edward's shift would mean for the family's power. Lucas exhaled slowly, the pieces falling into place. He thought of the protests, the handwritten agreement, Martin's threats. It all pointed to the same choice Edward had once faced. Maria reached over to a small table and picked up a sealed envelope, the edges yellowed with age. She placed it gently in Lucas's hand. This was meant for Martin. Edward wrote it just days before he died, but it was never given to him. I kept it, thinking one day it might matter. Lucas's fingers trembled as he broke the seal. The letter, written in his grandfather's strong, deliberate hand, spoke of hope and burden. It urged Martin to find a balance, to see beyond profit to the people who gave meaning to their name. It wasn't just a letter, it was a plea, a final attempt to shift a legacy before it was too late. Tears pricked Lucas's eyes as he read the final line. Asterisk, do not let the weight of expectation steal from you the freedom to do what is right. Asterisk, he folded the letter carefully and met Maria's gaze, gratitude and resolve intertwining in his expression. Thank you, he said, voice thick with emotion. I think I know what I need to do. Maria's eyes shone with unshed tears, a smile breaking through the sadness. It's time for Edward's true legacy to be honored, Lucas. Make sure it isn't silenced again. The room seemed brighter, as if the past had been given permission to breathe once more. Lucas stood, the letter in hand, and felt the weight shift, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. He would carry forward what Edward had started, no matter what it cost. It was no longer just about saving a building. It was about reclaiming what had been lost and proving that legacy could be built on more than just wealth. It could be built on choices that echoed through generations. The Thanksgiving event at the community center was already in full swing when Lucas arrived. The hall was alive with the chatter of families, the clinking of serving spoons against plates laden with food, and the soft strains of a piano being played by one of the teenagers. Strung with autumn leaves and warm lights, the space seemed to breathe with joy. Yet beneath it all was an undercurrent of anticipation. Word had spread about Lucas's presence and what it might mean. Lucas's gaze swept the room, catching sight of Martin near the back, his expression carved from stone. The tension between them had grown palpable, even at a distance. Martin's presence was a reminder of the stakes, but Lucas felt an unshakable calm wash over him. The letter from Edward rested in his pocket, its weight grounding him. He stepped up to the podium, clearing his throat as the crowd gradually hushed. Hundreds of eyes turned to him, curious and cautious, waiting to see if this man, known for his cold ambitions, would offer anything different tonight. "Thank you all for coming," Lucas began, voice steady. "I know my being here has raised questions, and I wanted tonight to be about answers." A murmur spread, like the shifting of the wind before a storm. Lucas glanced at Martin, whose eyes blazed with a silent warning. He ignored it. "I've spent my life believing that legacy was defined by profit, by how far you could stretch your reach. But in recent weeks, I discovered that's not the whole truth. My grandfather, Edward Thornton, understood that true worth comes from what you give, not just what you gain." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the fragile letter, holding it up for everyone to see. "This is a letter Edward wrote to my father, days before his death. It was meant to change the path of our family's future, but it never reached its destination. Tonight, I want to share it with all of you, because this story doesn't just belong to my family, it belongs to every person who believed in Edward's vision." The crowd leaned in, rapt, as Lucas began to read. Edward's words filled the room, painting a picture of a man who longed for balance, who had found meaning not in boardrooms but in laughter shared at community dinners and partnerships forged outside the glare of business deals. Each sentence fell like a stone into a pond, rippling out until the silence seemed to tremble with emotion. Lucas's voice caught as he read the final lines. Asterisk, "Do not let the weight of expectations steal from you the freedom to do what is right." Asterisk. He lowered the paper, his eyes meeting the hopeful, tear-brimmed gazes of people who had loved Edward for who he was, not just what he represented. Martin's chair scraped loudly as he stood, the noise jarring in the reverent silence. "Enough of this spectacle," he barked, face flushed with anger. "You're destroying everything we've worked for, Lucas. You think this sentimentality will save you? It will ruin you." Lucas's heart thudded, but he stood his ground. "No, Dad. It's not about ruin. It's about rebuilding. About choosing a different legacy." Martin's expression twisted, and without another word, he turned and pushed through the crowd, leaving murmurs and whispers in his wake. The sound of the door slamming shut echoed through the hall, final and resolute. For a beat, no one moved. Then, as if on cue, the crowd erupted into applause. It was a sound layered with relief, gratitude, and admiration. Lucas felt the tightness in his chest unfurl as he met Maya's eyes in the crowd, her nod carrying unspoken support. "Edward would be proud," Mrs. Green said, stepping forward, her eyes wet with tears. "You've brought his dream back to life." Lucas felt a rush of emotion swell within him. For the first time, he realized he was free, not from expectation, but from the confines of a legacy built on half-truths. He had chosen, not wealth, but purpose. The evening continued, transformed from a tense gathering into a celebration that honored the man whose legacy had touched so many. Lucas mingled, not as an outsider but as someone newly connected to the stories being shared. Tales of Edward's laughter, his tireless work, and his dreams filled the room, each one a reminder of why the center had to remain. A long table was set with dishes of warm stuffing, mashed potatoes, roasted vegetables, and turkey carved with care. Lucas took a seat, surrounded by old friends of Edward, young families who would benefit from the center, and Maya, who smiled with a mix of relief and pride. The warmth of the food, the clatter of cutlery, and the bright, unfiltered laughter filled Lucas with a contentment he hadn't felt in years. In the background, a portrait of Edward hung on the wall, the light catching the kindness in his eyes. It felt as though he were part of the gathering, his legacy breathing through the conversations, the shared stories, and the renewed hope that spread through the community. Lucas raised his glass, voice carrying above the din, to Edward, and to every choice that moves us toward what truly matters. The room cheered, voices blending in celebration as Lucas's heart lightened. This was more than a victory, it was the beginning of a new chapter, not just for him, but for every person who walked through the doors of the community center in search of something more than walls and rooms. It was a legacy rekindled, one built on compassion and purpose, now strong enough to endure.